Great. I think we're live. Awesome. Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us for our webinar entitled From Lab to Clinical Trial, Rare Disease and Newborn Screening. We have both internal worldwide clinical trials employees today and a huge number of external viewers. So thank you again so much for joining. It means a lot to me and the speakers that you're here. For those of you who don't know, my name is Derek Ansel. I'm Senior Director of Rare Disease Strategy here at Worldwide Clinical Trials. And our organization is a mid-sized contract research organization devoted and dedicated to the development of novel therapeutics for rare disease. As we are really focused in the rare disease space, we are keenly aware of the issues that rare disease patients face every day, especially when it comes to public policy around pricing, drug reimbursement, insurance, even diagnosis. In celebration for the upcoming Rare Disease Day on this Monday, the 28th, we're shedding some light about newborn screening, a test that we all have literally completed at birth, but honestly never really think about unless it does exactly what it's supposed to do. But before we begin and talk about a newborn screening and introduce our awesome speakers, just a few housekeeping rules. Everyone is muted. This is a different version of Teams, so you can't share anything on camera, you can't speak. It just makes it easier for everybody. If you do have a question or a comment, please use the Q&A. It will be moderated by myself and the speakers throughout the duration of today's talk. If you do have questions, please do ask throughout. We will take about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of our conversation today for the speakers to address your comments. I can't wait to introduce our fantastic speakers. You can see them on camera. They are Amy Gaviglio and Anthony Steyermark. They have very impressive bios, so please give me a couple minutes to go through their biographies. Amy is a genetic counselor who consults for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Association of Public Health Laboratories, and Expecting Health. She's also the co-chair of APHL's New Disorders Work Group and CCHD's Data Response Team. Amy is a member of several of APHL's work groups, including short-term follow-up, legal and legislative issues in newborn screening, and health information technology. She also serves as the chair of the Newborn Screening Expert Panel for the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute, chair of the Executive Committee for Minnesota's Rare Disease Advisory Council, and is on the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children's Education and Training Work Group. Tony is the medical director for the Legacy of Angels Foundation, which is a nonprofit rare disease advocacy group dedicated to improve the lives of children by working to promote the expansion of newborn screening. Tony supervised newborn screening long-term follow-up at the Minnesota Department of Health, advocating for infants with newborn screening conditions. Noticing that data access and data sharing as a huge barrier to the progress in children and youth with special needs advocacy, he went to supervise interoperability work in the Office for Health Information Technology at the Minnesota Department of Health. With the start of COVID in 2020 in Minnesota, Tony was asked to be the Deputy Incident Manager for the Department of Health, helping to lead the state's testing efforts. And with that, and both impressive bios with Amy and Tony, let's kick things off and pass it to Amy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Derek, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to celebrate Rare Disease Day with you all and to bring awareness to newborn screening and its role in identifying infants with rare disease, as well as its potential utility in clinical trials. Next slide, please. I have no relevant financial disclosures to make, and though, as was mentioned, I am a contractor for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, this presentation does not represent the views of the CDC, nor any work done on behalf of CDC. Next slide, please. So before we delve in, I always like to kind of level set and want to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what screening is and what newborn screening is in particular. So this schematic illustrates the process of newborn screening, whereby samples are collected from a population of newborns, typically around 24 to 48 hours after birth. We use a dry blood spot or filter paper matrix, and we look at a number of analytes as well as molecular genes and variants. We examine these, and these screening tests weed out those that are at high risk of having the disease, so those shown in orange at the top, versus those that are lower risk who kind of pass through the screen, so those are the ones in green at the bottom. So those newborns that are identified as having a higher risk must complete further testing, diagnostic testing, to determine whether the child is indeed affected, a true positive screening result, or whether the child is actually unaffected, or what we would consider a false positive screening result. It's really important for us to not forget, though, about those infants who pass through the screen. While the vast majority will truly be unaffected or have true negative screening results, there are some infants who may actually be affected and thus had false negative screening results. Next slide, please. So these 4 points are really important to understanding the basis of newborn screening. First and foremost, newborn screening programs are public health programs that are typically administered at a state or jurisdictional level. But to be successful, programs really require a coordinated network of stakeholders representing families, research, policy, medicine, as well as support services. Newborn screening programs are state-based in the United States or country-based worldwide, which means that we often see variations between newborn screening programs. And we often joke in the newborn screening community that if you've seen one newborn screening program, you've seen one newborn screening program. In the US, newborn screening programs are mandated opt-out programs. So what this means is that informed consent is not obtained, and the default is for newborn screening to occur. In nearly every state, however, parents do have the option to opt out or refuse newborn screening on behalf of their child. And finally, newborn screening is really designed to detect treatable disorders asymptomatically. And I'll explain this concept more in just a bit. Next slide, please. So if you'll indulge me, I know it's a bit early for just a minute for a brief history lesson. I really like to frame newborn screening as this really incredible intersection of advocacy, policy, and science. So if we look at the advent of newborn screening for phenylketonuria, which was our first disease, also known as PKU, we actually can go all the way back to 1934 with a Norwegian mother who really fought tirelessly to understand the cause of her children's developmental delay, which ultimately led to the discovery of PKU as a disease. If we move along the time continuum to 1951 and the treatment for PKU, which is simply removal of the amino acid phenylalanine from the diet, this discovery was largely due to the perseverance of a British mother with a child who had PKU, who was really desperate to find a way to help her child. So from there, if we go across the pond and a little bit later in the 1950s, we see the creation of 2 tests for the earlier diagnosis of PKU. The first was the wet diaper ferric chloride test, which came out of LA. And then a shorter time later, the bacterial inhibition assay developed by Dr. Robert Guthrie out of Buffalo. His test would later become the first newborn screening test. He is known as the godfather of newborn screening, with Massachusetts beginning universal screening in 1963. Next slide, please. And this time period, the 1960s, really marked a shift in medicine to looking at preventative care. And to this end, the World Health Organization in 1968 commissioned a report from Wilson and Youngner. And the purpose of this report was to provide a knowledge base on the principles and practice of screening in the prevention of disease. It's important for us to note that this report was not specifically focused on newborn screening, but rather just early detection through screening as a whole. So things including cancer and cardiovascular screening programs. And early on in this report, they make what I think is a really important point, that the idea of detecting a disease early is, of course, admirable and quite honestly seems quite simple, but in fact is quite complicated when you think about successfully implementing at a population level. Next slide, please. So the highlight of the report are known as the Wilson and Youngner criteria, which is a set of 10 components that a disease should meet to be considered for a population screening program. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will highlight a couple. The first are points number 2 and 3, which state that there should be an accepted treatment and availability of diagnostic and treatment centers. Point number 5, of course, we should have a suitable test. Point number 8, there should be guidelines and agreement on who needs treatment. And then finally, point number 9, that the benefits of screening should outweigh the costs. Next slide. So despite this guidance on qualities of diseases for population screening from Wilson and Youngner, newborn screening programs really evolved sporadically throughout the world. And by 2000, there were really significant differences between state and country newborn screening programs. And this really gave rise to a number of initiatives that were aimed at providing more concrete guidance at the federal level regarding which diseases truly met screening criteria in efforts to better kind of harmonize screening processes across the country in the US. So this work led to the creation of 2 important elements. The first is the creation in 2004 of the Federal Advisory Council on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, as well as a federally recommended panel of disorders, which comes out of that group, called the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel. Next slide. So very briefly, the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel, it's also known as the RUSP, has become essentially a baseline for newborn screening as to which disorders have been approved for screening at the federal level. So while this is a US-centric process, the global community does often look to this work for their own guidance as well. So this slide illustrates the current evidentiary process for adding a disease to the RUSP. It starts by advocates, researchers, clinicians submitting a nomination package. This package gets reviewed for completeness and goes to kind of a sub-working group within the advisory council called the Nomination and Prioritization Work Group for further review. This group will review the nomination package and make a recommendation to the full council on whether they think the disease is ready for a complete evidence review. If the committee votes to move the disease along in the process, there will be a 9-month full review of the disease, looking at everything from the performance metrics of the test, to the readiness of public health programs to screen for the disease, to diagnosis and treatment efficacy. After that 9-month period, the committee will vote on whether to add it to the RUSP. If that vote is yes, it then goes to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who has 180 days to make an ultimate decision as to whether the disease is added or not. So as you can see, this process is quite lengthy, requires a lot of knowledge about a disease. And this is really becoming increasingly difficult as we start to look at and consider rarer and ultra rare diseases. Next slide, please. So even with a process such as this, newborn screening has really continued to expand. And while we are talking about rare diseases, I always like to illustrate that the collective impact of newborn screening continues to grow. So while we started with just one disease, as I mentioned earlier, PKU in 1963, with a birth prevalence of around 1 in 10,000, we are now up to 59 diseases on the RUSP that use that dried blood spot matrix, and we're impacting approximately 1 in 545 newborns in the US each year. Next slide. So the question remains, has the RUSP reduced screening discrepancies across the state? And I can definitively say yes-ish. So if we look more recently and kind of hone in on 3 recent additions to the RUSP, X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy, Pompe disease, and mucopolysaccharidosis type 1, we can see we have a pretty wide variation once again on who is screening and who is not. If you just click one more time, I think I have another image there. Perfect, thank you. If we look at all diseases screened for in the US in this heat map, the variation again isn't apparent. Right now, a state screening for anywhere between 31 and 76 diseases. Next slide. So the same lack of standardization we are seeing in the US is also evident worldwide, is illustrated by one, the fact that I had a really difficult time even finding a good indication of newborn screening status by country, but also by this map that I did find, where you can see the varying percentage of newborns screened in each country, each of which also have quite different panels of diseases. So there was also, and I put this here, was a recent article that is shown here that highlights, at least in Europe, the vast differences between programs. Next slide. So why, despite these efforts to harmonize, do we still see discrepancies? Really, it's for a number of reasons. The first is the rise in utilizing the legislative process to add diseases rather than the RUSP process. So typically these are for diseases that have not been evaluated federally or have been and have not been recommended. So legislation tends to be sparked by family advocacy or disease organizations within the state who are, quite frankly, frustrated or overwhelmed by the amount of time it takes to go through the RUSP process. More practically, some of this comes down to just simple variations in state or country resources and processes for adding and implementing disorders. And this disparity, I think, between kind of what I will call well-resourced and poorly resourced programs has really become even more evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. But ultimately, really the variation and discrepancy comes down to a key aspect of the RUSP, in that the R does not stand for required, but stands for recommended, which means that it still largely comes down to the state to add a disorder. And some of the recent additions have really brought to light specific concerns for some states, particularly that the RUSP process as it stands right now does not fully take into account sometimes the complexity of testing that is needed or the access to treatment and specialists in their assessment. Next slide, please. So the diseases added in the last decade have brought with them both old and new challenges for newborn screening programs. So we are still often faced with an under-recognized disease spectrum that really comes to light when applying screening to the population, where we start to detect more milder variations of the disease that typically weren't recognized clinically. In newborn screening, I think we have never truly really addressed issues of access and availability of treatment, nor have we successfully filled gaps in provider and patient education. Some of the new challenges arising during this time have included disorders that have known pseudodeficiency alleles, which really wreak havoc on our biochemical screening assays, as we are not able to distinguish those with pseudodeficiency, who are essentially clinically benign, from a true affected disease state. We've also added some diseases, X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy is a great example, that have absolutely no genotype-phenotype relationship. And this, along with the fact that newborn screening is expanding to use more gene sequencing and thus more detection of variants of uncertain significance, has really led to an increased ability for us to provide any certainty around prognosis in some cases. Next slide. But to end my section, I really want to focus in on the future of the newborn screening system and how this pertains potentially to your work in clinical trials. And I'll start by asking the question, can the newborn screening system respond to increased treatment availability? So historically, technology or our ability to actually detect a reliable biomarker was the limiting factor in adding a disease to newborn screening. This role as limiting factor has now been taken on by treatment availability. So right now, the single biggest thing holding up screening for many diseases is the availability of an effective treatment. But it's very likely that this scale is also going to tip. So the FDA, as many of you probably know, has predicted that by 2025, we will see 10 to 20 gene and cell therapy approvals each year. The pipeline of rare disease treatment, including oncological rare diseases, is quite promising, with more than 560 drugs in development. We also know that we only have treatment right now for a very small percentage of rare diseases. So we, as a newborn screening system, need to become much more prepared to deal with the potential that we may be faced with a lot of diseases with new treatments that all want to be added to newborn screening. And we need to figure out how we can be more nimble in responding to this. Next slide. And one of the most recent diseases added to the RUSP, spinal muscular atrophy, is really a great example of how treatment approval can drive quick newborn screening expansion. So with SMA, we had FDA approval of the first drug in December of 2016, and in only 1.5 years, which is very exceedingly quick in the government, the disease was added to the RUSP, and you can see now that nearly all states have begun screening for SMA. And so this rapid expansion was driven largely by the collaborative efforts of advocates, disease organizations, affected families, and pharmaceutical companies. And I believe really is a model we will see more and more of as the rare disease community understands the importance of moving quickly from clinical trial to FDA approval to newborn screening, or even perhaps newborn screening, clinical trial, FDA approval, which is a point I think that Tony will touch on a bit more in his section. So next slide. So before transitioning to Tony, I want to set the tone on comparing the patient diagnostic journey with and without newborn screening. So on the left, we can see that rare disease families often go through a multi-year diagnostic odyssey involving multiple clinicians and researchers prior to getting an accurate diagnosis. This delay often leads to patients missing the opportunity for early and beneficial treatment or enrollment in clinical trials. If we look over to the right, however, with newborn screening, we can essentially cut out that winding road by providing clinicians with a pointed direction for diagnostic studies, which often allows the administration of treatment or at least discussion of treatment options within days to weeks. Next slide. So with that, I will turn it over to Tony to really hone in on the patient experience and the opportunities for newborn screening, advocates, and clinical trials. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Amy, and thank you, Derek, for this opportunity to speak to you all, and welcome to the audience. Next slide, please. So I'd like to spend a few minutes this morning talking about the intersection of newborn screening, rare diseases, and clinical trials, and identify some of the challenges, some of which Amy already talked about, highlight a central paradox when it comes to newborn screening, rare diseases, and clinical trials, but really center in on hope and opportunities. So as Amy said, newborn screening is universal. It provides for early identification, and that information can lead to an early diagnosis for the infant. On the treatment side, what we expect is that available treatments can result from clinical trials. We expect that families can make informed decisions and that families have access to the clinicians and the treatments that result in the best possible outcomes. And so for the families to make informed decisions, they have to have all of the information that they need. And for the families to have access to the clinicians and the treatments, then the clinicians and treatments have to be equitably distributed. Next slide, please. So the growth of newborn screening, Amy talked about this a little bit earlier, just to highlight for the last few years, there have been 4 conditions added to the RUSP since 2015, and there are currently 3 conditions that are under consideration by the ACT-DNC as of February 2022. And in large part, it's due to two different reasons. The first is an increase in the technology for screening. So we're seeing a lot more multiplexing of the biochemical analyses in newborn screening labs. And we're also seeing advances in gene sequencing, both in terms of decrease in cost and decrease in the time that it takes to accomplish gene sequencing, and also a greater understanding of disease-causing variants. On the treatment side, we're seeing more gene therapy treatments that are FDA approved, and a lot of gene therapy trials, specifically some for newborn screening conditions. Next slide, please. So as of July 2021, there were 435 therapies in development for non-oncological rare diseases. I know Amy had some slightly different numbers. And then specifically looking at current newborn screening conditions or likely newborn screening conditions, there's 19 clinical trials for DMD, 18 for sickle cell, 16 for cystic fibrosis, 10 for Fabry, 8 for Pompe, and 3 for Krabbe. Duchenne muscular dystrophy will likely be added to the recommended uniform screening panel within the next 5 years. Fabry has already been under consideration by several states, and Krabbe disease, we're already seeing 10 states screening for Krabbe. Next slide, please. So challenges, what's the paradox, and what are the opportunities and hope? Next slide, please. So Amy presented a slightly different diagram of this, but it's the same idea that newborn screening is a relatively simple concept. The newborn screening lab generates a presumptive positive result that gets called out to the primary care provider, who brings in the family. The PCP then provides those newborn screening data plus other data to a specialist. The family sees the specialist. Depending on the complexity of the disease, there may be a subspecialist involved. Again, families involved in this, obviously. And then there's ongoing treatment and monitoring through the clinic or the medical home. Next slide, please. However, when we start looking at some of the challenges and stakeholders, the landscape becomes a lot more complicated. In the upper left, there's regulatory and oversight by federal agencies. In the lower left, state legislatures may have specific bills or restrictions on newborn screening. There's the state's view of public health, which will influence how well resourced the newborn screening program is. A big one is whether the primary care provider already has a relationship with the family. In many cases, the PCP that's listed on the newborn screening card has never seen the family. So this would be the first time that the family is meeting with that primary care provider, and that PCP is delivering some pretty devastating news. Then what does that primary care provider even know about the rare disease? And in most cases, the answer is zero, because they are rare diseases and most primary care providers have just never encountered these conditions. Then there's questions about access. What's the location of the family compared to the location of the specialist in the state? And then if it's a very rare disease, is there a subspecialist in the state, or is the family going to have to travel out of state? And then what are the treatment options, and what does treatment and follow-up look like? Next slide, please. Overlaying that, there are several overarching concepts. What's the family's socioeconomic level? Is English their primary language? What's their health insurance look like? There's a big concern is the family's access to unbiased information and current information when they need it. And then there's the role of advocacy groups, industry, basic research, and clinical trials. Next slide, please. You don't have to go into the details on this. This is actually a slide that Amy had put together a little while ago. It just shows the complexity of the different stakeholders that are involved with newborn screening, with policy, ethics, and advocacy, health department, clinical world, family support organizations, and then quality assurance and research. Next slide, please. So what are some of the challenges? One is that we're dealing with state-specific newborn screening panels and processes. As Amy said, once you've seen one newborn screening program, you've seen one newborn screening program. There's the family socioeconomic status. Care coordination for rare diseases can be exceedingly complex. There's access to information, access to specialists and subspecialists, and then the access to treatment. Next slide, please. And then what's the paradox? So as Amy said, for a condition to be added to the newborn screening recommended uniform screening panel, there must be an approved therapy. And for that therapy to be approved, there must have been some clinical trials. And if we're talking about newborn screening conditions which impact newborns and infants, the criteria for inclusion in those clinical trials will often include early identified babies and infants. And the best way to identify babies and infants is through newborn screening. But how can babies and infants be enrolled in a clinical trial if they're not already identified by newborn screening, but the condition can't be added to the RUSP unless there's already a treatment? So we have a very chicken and the egg situation here. Next slide, please. But in spite of all of these challenges, there are a lot of opportunities and there's a lot of hope on the horizon. So states run or can run pilot screening programs. An example of that is Georgia. Their Department of Health is currently running a pilot program for Krabbe disease, and that began in September. There are research studies such as North Carolina's Early Check and New York's Screen Plus. Both of those offer expanded newborn screening panels on top of the state's mandated newborn screening. These are considered opt-in programs. These provide a lot of opportunity, but there's also some challenges. One is that there's some equity issues because they may be limited geographically. And again, these are state-based, so the state needs to have the resources to support and implement these research studies. Next slide, please. At the federal level, one big question is whether the Health Resources and Services Administration, which oversees the RUSP nomination process, can make that nomination and approval process a bit easier. Right now, it is very complex and it can take several years from nomination to approval. Federal agencies such as HRSA, NIH, and FDA, and national newborn screening organizations can fund research into these gaps and opportunities, especially examining areas around equity and access. Next slide, please. Patient advocacy groups can play a very, very strong, powerful role in newborn screening and rare diseases. They can raise awareness. They can fund research into rare diseases, such as the CF Foundation, Cure SMA, and the Legacy of Angels Foundation, which is the organization that I belong to. Parent advocacy groups can also convene key stakeholders, including families, newborn screening leaders, clinicians, and the pharmaceutical industry. And a key here really is to bring in families early and to listen to the family experiences, because oftentimes the experience that newborn screening labs think families are having and that clinicians think families are having can be very, very different than the experiences that the families are actually having. There's opportunities to work with clinicians to better understand their needs and their opportunities and what their processes are, and to really understand what is working and what is not. And there is definitely the need to develop more specialist expertise across the U.S. When we look at some of the ultra rare conditions, there are very few subspecialists that can treat some of the conditions, such as Krabbe disease. And then there also needs to be a discussion, and I think that this is particularly important for the pharmaceutical industry and clinical trials, of what therapy and treatment means. Traditionally, newborn screening has looked at treatment or therapy to be curative or semi-curative, but some parents really just want to see an improved quality of life, and they want to see their child hit developmental milestones. Next slide, please. We're really seeing some excellent progress in basic research and industry. So there's increased research in the natural history of rare diseases, increased identification of key biomarkers, and those biomarkers can be used to develop screening methodologies and also to develop methodologies that tell us more about the disease course for the infant, and there's the development of high throughput screening methods. And while this is great, as Amy said a little bit earlier, the increase in knowledge is leading to more diseases being nominated to the newborn screening panels, and that is leading to a bottleneck. The pharmaceutical industry can partner with newborn screening stakeholders to better understand the very nuanced newborn screening process and seek out patient advocacy groups to work with them as they convene stakeholders and also to help connect with families. Next slide, please. So there are a few notes of caution. There's a trend towards adding newborn screening conditions at the state level through legislation. This is often driven by parent advocates. And as Amy said, it's understandable because many parent advocates are really tired of the long drawn out process. However, this can happen sometimes when the state's entire system may not be ready for newborn screening for a condition. Just because there is a screening methodology and there's a treatment available doesn't necessarily mean that a state is ready for newborn screening. And sometimes when conditions are added legislatively, they are unfunded mandates, and state health departments really struggle with that, understandably. Parents want access to clinical trials because of the hope that they offer for their infant or newborn, but the clinical trials need to have narrow inclusion parameters to ensure that they are successful and that they can then develop broad label FDA approval. So here we really have to balance the needs of a few parents who really want access to the clinical trials with the broader good that successful clinical trials can bring to families in the future. So stakeholders have to really keep their eyes on clear screening methodologies that identify babies with target conditions and minimize false positives, and to see successful clinical trials that lead to that broad label FDA approval. Next slide, please. So just to wrap things up, so what my main needs would be from the rare disease and newborn screening community would include non-biased and non-directive and understandable information so that families know what their options are and can make informed decisions. And this must be a collaborative effort. For some rare diseases, what we hear sometimes is that parents are directed to clinicaltrials.gov, and I'm sure that you all know that for the average layperson, the information there is exceedingly difficult to navigate. We're also seeing some clinicians recommend specific clinical trials or specific therapies over others. Sometimes that's because they are unfamiliar with other clinical trials or with other therapies, and sometimes it's because they have a vested interest in a specific trial or therapy. So that information should include what are all of the treatment options, where are the treatment options throughout the United States or even Europe, if that's where the opportunity is, and then what are the outcomes. We need more attention to equity. Newborn screening is universal, and as such, everyone has access to being screened. But the access to treatment is not equitable. We see many social, cultural, language, economic, geographic barriers that exist really literally for every single newborn screening condition. There's an increased attention right now being paid to equity, and of course that ties into much larger national social issues. So there's a lot of work to be done there, but when we're looking at the information that is available to families, that as well should be universal and take into consideration social, cultural, language, economic, and geographic issues. And then lastly, there should be more collaboration between key stakeholders, regulatory agencies at the federal and state level, advocacy groups, state newborn screening programs, clinicians, and industry, so that we can all work together to develop new therapies and ensure equitable access. And I would say that this platform that Derek has provided for Amy and I for you all is one great step towards more collaboration between some of the key stakeholders. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll be done, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Derek, I think you're on mute.
Of course, it's going to happen, right, Amy? Thank you. Well, I was just saying, great job, everybody, both so much. I always learn something new when you guys speak to me about newborn screening. Our contact information is below if you have any questions after today's discussion, but we have quite a bit of questions from the Q&A, from the chat function. So let's kick things off. The first question, Amy, I'm going to give to you because it was actually a question I asked you a couple months ago. Instead of it being managed at the state level, why isn't newborn screening managed at the national level?
Yeah, that's a common question. And honestly, I don't know that I have a much better answer than I think it's historical. You know, when we were talking about the advent of newborn screening, it really rolled out on a state-by-state basis. And I think part of that has to do with the varying resources that states have, and also the focus on state sovereignty in this country. But I would say more than ever, I'm starting to hear from the community the need to kind of reassess some of that, and thinking more about maybe regionalization approaches as a baby step to maybe federal approaches. But you know, I often say, like, if we were to colonize Mars and want to do a newborn screening program, we wouldn't do it this way. We would probably have done it state by state now looking back. So I think it's just a product of the way it historically rolled out. But it is something that's being questioned more than I've ever seen it before right now in the community.
No, that's great. Questioning is good for sure. So hopefully one day we'll see some pathway to better access. Next one I feel is great for Tony. Tony, because you mentioned that there's an opportunity to partner with newborn screening stakeholders to really understand the nuances to the process. But largely, what can organizations, groups, individuals do to support newborn screening public policy, to advocate on their behalf?
Yeah, thank you, Derek. That's a great question. You know, there's a few different ways of doing it. I think individuals can reach out to newborn screening panel. I know in Minnesota, for example, the Minnesota newborn screening panel, at least pre-COVID, would do lab tours, and there's the opportunity to meet with newborn screening managers to better understand the newborn screening process. If anyone in a state has questions of the screening program, if it's something that is more disease specific, there are a lot of parent advocacy groups. And so working with parent advocacy groups, I think, is a really great way of becoming involved. Most advocacy groups are grassroots efforts. They are often founded and led by very passionate parents. And one thing that I've learned is that when you have very passionate parents, everything is possible. Parents can be very, very determined to get their way, and that is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So advocacy groups just have a tremendous amount of power. And then at the national level, there are also rare disease advocacy groups such as NORD and GLIA, which works with leukodystrophies.
Great, thank you. I hope you all can keep that in mind as we go to Rare Disease Day this Monday as a way to get engaged with the community. I hope you think of newborn screening. Back to Amy for this one. Do you feel that the RUSP will ever be required?
That's a really good question. Officially, no, I don't think that they would ever move it to say you have to screen for these disorders. But I would say there is a sense almost already that it is kind of required in terms of the pressure. Once it's added to the RUSP, the pressure that states are under to add the disease. So while technically it's not required, I think many kind of feel like they need to go in that direction. And there have been efforts more recently, kind of legislatively, state by state. They're called RUSP alignment legislation, which really require the states to align with the RUSP within a certain amount of time. So even though technically at the federal level it is still recommended, I think we're kind of seeing this blurring of going to more of a required. So this is a long-winded answer, but I can't imagine that at the federal level they'd ever say you have to, but there are efforts, I think, that supplement it, that kind of make it more of something that feels a bit more required.
Great, thank you. Tony, I'm going to give you this one. Is there a framework that you see that advocacy groups follow to get their condition listed on a newborn screening panel?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Derek. The answer is yes and no, or I should say no and yes. No, what we're seeing is most advocacy groups tend to reinvent the wheel. The nomination process for the RUSP, as Amy said, is very complicated. The nomination form, and I just wrote one for our state's newborn screening program for Krabbe disease, really needs to include a lot of technical information, clinical information that many lay people, families just simply don't have access to. So up until now, I haven't seen any framework that advocacy groups have used to nominate a condition. That being said, there is a framework available that the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy Group put together. They published a paper in 2017, and I'm looking at my cheat sheet here. It's a roadmap to newborn screening for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. That really provides a really nice framework, a good understanding of the nuanced newborn screening process, the nomination process. And while it's DMD focused, I think the DMD specifics can be plucked out, and the framework can be used for any condition.
Great, thank you. Makes a lot of sense. We do that very frequently in rare disease. There's a lot of commonalities in some disorders that can be given to others. So it's great that they publish that and can be a resource for other groups that might be a little bit smaller and not have the funding as PPMD or Cure SMA or the CF Foundation to really drive newborn screening. A couple more questions. We got actually a lot of questions, so I think we have plenty of time to answer them. I will take this next one. Are clinical trials run by NIH or pharma? And I think the answer is all of the above. The trials that we run here worldwide are typically done by pharmaceutical companies or biotechnology companies, but of course the government does do a large amount of clinical trials, particularly at the NIH. So when we talk about clinical trials here, we're talking about all of the above: government funded, investigator initiated, or sponsored trials from the pharmaceutical industry. Amy, I know you were working on this other one behind the scenes about, is there a public domain or central repository or place at all to view which diseases are currently under review, kind of following the pathway that you've outlined? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so if you want to look for the ones that are currently being reviewed by that federal oversight committee, that advisory committee on heritable diseases in newborns and children, just go to their website. If you Google ACHDNC HRSA, HRSA is alphabet soup. We can probably put that in a chat or something, but you can follow which ones have been nominated. If you are looking more globally at potential conditions that are being identified as potential candidates for newborn screening, there is a group, it's called the Newborn Screening Translational Research Network. It's actually under NIH. They have a great new resource that they've just put together where they're really tracking what they call candidate conditions. So I think they've got maybe 35 right now, but I was just talking to them. I think they're going to double it. So that's a great way to see where, what conditions are even kind of on our radar right now, and maybe making its way to that process. So I would point you to probably those two resources for both what's going on right now and what we expect to be coming. And I can figure out a way to get those links to you all. Yeah.
We might do another write-up with all the questions that we've had.
Perfect.
I'm just going to ask these two, and I think, either Tony or Amy, you can tackle them. I think they are really related. So first one is, who covers the cost of newborn screening? Is it the state or insurance? I'm assuming also private insurance. And then in follow-up, once the diagnosis is made, how are the further diagnostic needs covered, also by insurance or Medicaid or by the state? So I'll just open that up to the both of you.
I can take the first and then I'll swing the second to you, Tony. So newborn screening programs are typically, and again, this is going to be where there's variations, but typically they are funded by the sale of actually that dried blood spot card or that filter paper matrix. So they sell those cards to birthing facilities, and that's how they're funded. The birthing facilities tend to turn around and they, it's hard to know kind of how they bill for that. It varies. They could just roll it into the delivery charge. They could pull it out and actually bill based on CPT codes of what we're screening for. So again, that's a little bit different, not only state by state, but facility by facility. So typically, they're funded, though, by the sale of those cards, and insurance under the ACA does need to cover newborn screening as a preventative care. I will make one also note that many newborn screening programs do have the option to waive fees for the newborn screening card for for individuals who don't have insurance, for, say, the plainclothes community. We're not at all money makers. We're essentially nonprofits, and it's really important for us to give every child the opportunity for screening, regardless of whether they can pay for it or not. So that does tend to be an option for the screening itself. And I'll let Tony handle the diagnostic testing piece.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Yeah, that's a really good question. And as you'd expect, it's a very complex world. And it depends on the condition. If it, for some newborn screening conditions, where the diagnosis and the treatment is fairly straightforward, something like biotinidase deficiency, for example, then insurance would typically cover the cost of both diagnosis and ongoing treatment and ongoing monitoring. So it's third-party payer, either private insurance or Medicaid. For some of the more complex conditions, though, and some of the ultra rare diseases, there it becomes a lot harder. Sometimes the best case scenario is that it's still third-party payer or Medicaid. For some of the new rare diseases where there are not clinicians or subspecialists that are in the state and the family has to travel, Medicaid only pays for or tends to only pay for treatment within their own state lines. What we're seeing for some of the ultra rare conditions is families have to travel to clinical centers that are out of state. Some of the clinical centers take donations or they take grants. They receive grants that pay for the families to travel. One of the conditions that I work with, Krabbe disease, some of the treatment centers are affiliated with Ronald McDonald House, so families can stay there. And for some of the treatments as well that are very, very expensive, it's the pharmaceutical industry that provides the treatment at no cost to those families. So I know it's a little bit of a wishy-washy answer, but it depends on the complexity of the condition.
Great, thanks, Tony. I feel like that's the theme of today. When you think of newborn screening, you think it's the one and done solution, but to Amy's point, one newborn screening program is just one newborn screening program. I really like this next question, so I definitely want to ask it. Where are the samples processed? In each hospital, a children's hospital, state health department, etc.?
Yeah, I can take that. So the samples are collected by each birth facility. So they're actually doing the heel stick or the phlebotomy, and many places have trained their midwives as well, so that home births are also getting newborn screening. So that collection is happening at the hospital, but then it is sent in nearly all cases to the public health lab at the state who run all the samples for the state. So, that can mean if you're in Texas, thousands of samples a day. So newborn screening labs are very high throughput. They also work 6 to 7 days a week because babies are born all the time and we don't take days off. But yeah, so the actual analysis of the biochemical and molecular analysis tends to happen at the public health lab within the state or country, and all samples go there regardless of where they were collected in the state.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. There's a lot of questions on particular, very specific disorders. Is Ehlers-Danlos being screened, maple syrup urine disease screened? So I think what we can do is provide those resources that Amy, you mentioned about how to tell what's on a panel currently or what's being pending to be added to a panel, so that any participant or viewer who wants to look at a particular disorder or disease can look that up for their individual state or country. But let's ask one more question. This one seems, I think, very timely to both of your discussions. Does a therapeutic development improve the likelihood of inserting newborn screening in a panel? So I guess for a particular disorder, if there's a promising therapy, maybe gene therapies, are you seeing that, that maybe that time duration to get on the panel to be a little bit shorter? Probably question for both of you.
How about I'll go first on it, and then Amy, you can add and fill in the gaps. I think the answer is definitely yes. One of the criteria for addition to at the federal level to the RUSP is that there has to be a treatment, an effective treatment, and that typically means an FDA-approved treatment. So, until there is an approved treatment, it will likely not be added to the RUSP. But depending on where in the pipeline that treatment is, then I think a nomination package can certainly be put together. And then the outcomes from the clinical trials, and once the therapy is FDA approved, right, that can be dropped in, and then the nomination package submitted. And I would say the same thing can happen at the state level. What we're seeing is a lot of advocacy groups are going straight to state newborn screening panels or programs and bypassing the federal RUSP, and then so the same would apply. Certainly, having a therapy that is in development, as long as the other pieces are in place, I think tremendously improves the chances of that condition being added.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The only thing I would add is that one option, kind of as you're going through that process, if you're in that clinical trial kind of process, is looking at pilots where you are consenting the family, as opposed to, mandated newborn screening where the families are not consented. That can be kind of a nice option to give that opportunity to families kind of in between actually having it on the newborn screening panel.
Great, thank you. I think we are really out of time for questions, but there's a lot more in the chat, so please keep them coming. We will get back to you. Our email addresses are here as well if we have any additional comments or questions after today. But thank you again for joining our talk in celebration for Rare Disease Day again on the 28th, this upcoming Monday. And again, as you please head into the weekend, we really do encourage you to check out rarediseaseday.org to find a number of events local in your community so that you can engage and work with rare disease patients and celebrate that day together. Thanks again, Tony and Amy, and looking forward to our next great discussion together.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.